Well, that's really funny because you would think I would have thought about that 1,000 times, but I really haven't. But I do know that in the story The Leaving, which was the very first adult story I wrote, and that's the one I sent to the CBC, and that's the one that won that thing. That's a kind of feminist story because it's the reading of the feminine mystique that makes that woman sit up and take notice and think, what can I do about my life? And she doesn't manage to do a great deal, but she makes enough difference that her life is a different thing, and her daughter's life is a totally different thing. And I suppose this sometimes comes in, but often the women are not all that marvelous people. There was a friend who was probably, this would be about 20 years ago, and he was probably 10 years older than I was. So he was probably around, if you work out the arithmetic, he was probably about 70. And he had been very ill. So I thought, okay, I'll send him a couple of my books, my short story collections. And he wrote back and said, thank you very much for your books. And I enjoyed them, but why are you always writing about horrible men? He was very offended. So I went through, I think maybe I sent him The Leaving, but I may have sent him two. I went through and I put BW, BM, in the table of contents. Bad woman, bad man, bad woman, bad man. And I found it was almost equal. I don't know whether I ever wrote him back and said, hey God, you're wrong. But I know I have to be a little bit careful not to talk too much about women or about girls, because I think it was after I wrote Fractures, I got a sheaf of letters from some high school or junior high class, and they were all saying they liked the book, they liked the book, they liked the book. 2 boys wrote and said, we hate your book because you never write anything except stories about girls. So when I wrote Friendships, I was very careful to make it half and half boys and half girls. I do know girls so much better than I do know boys. I was in a family with 1 sister, no boys, and I have 2 daughters, no boys, and so I've seen girls much more closely than I have boys. But I've seen lots of boys, so I can write about them. I'm just more interested in writing about girls. But I realize if I'm going to think about readership, which I almost never do, I have to think a little bit about that. Better dig up a story about a boy before I start another collection. I think after those 2 letters, I would probably think that much. Is this going to be about a boy or is this going to be about a girl? Now, I wrote Oliver's Wars without any of those thoughts. I wrote Oliver's Wars because the first Gulf War was going on, which was around 1990, I think. And I was terrified by that war. Strangely enough, more terrified by that war than I was by these present wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, because I thought it was going to turn into a world conflict, and I was very much alive and aware during World War II. So I know what it is like to live in those times, and what it is like particularly to live in Halifax, because you're very close to any war that's going on, because of it being the gateway to the interior of our country, and a means of getting overseas with troops and ammunition and food and all this kind of thing. And I didn't want another war. So I wrote Oliver's Wars as a kind of intentional therapy for me. Keep my mind busy on the book so I'm not watching the newscasts and wondering if this thing is going to proliferate into something a lot more huge. And it turned out it was a very short war. But it looked for a while as though it were going to be something pretty difficult.